He walked into the park that afternoon, and the wilderness swallowed him whole. Those were the last known moments anyone would ever see Paul Fugate alive. A 41-year-old National Park Service ranger, Paul was a man of meticulous routine, deeply devoted to the jagged beauty of Chiricahua National Monument in southeastern Arizona. On January 13, 1980, he left the visitor center to inspect a trail near the historic Faraway Ranch, carrying nothing but his radio, flashlight, and an unshakable sense of duty. By 2 p.m., he had vanished. Not a word over the radio. Not a trace on the familiar trails he had walked countless times before. His uniform, wallet, and personal belongings were left behind in the visitor center, as if he had simply stepped into thin air. The first rangers to notice his absence initially assumed a delay, a late check-in, a miscommunication. But hours stretched into an evening filled with mounting dread. The park, usually alive with the sounds of wind through pine and the distant calls of coyotes, seemed to close in like a trap. When search parties arrived, they combed every ridge, canyon, and narrow passage, their flashlights cutting through the shadows. Yet Paul was nowhere. The wilderness of Chiricahua is vast, rugged, and unyielding. Lava rock formations twist into towering pinnacles, creating hidden nooks where shadows gather like living things. It was in this maze of stone and forest that Paul had disappeared. The silence left in his absence was deafening. Every rock, every tree, every trail seemed to mock the frantic calls of the searchers. Speculation rose immediately. Had he fallen, encountered criminals, or did he vanish on purpose? No footprints led to any cliff or path that might explain an accident. Witnesses were scarce, and those who claimed to have seen him. Most notably, a report of a man slumped between two figures in a pickup truck offered more questions than answers. The desert, indifferent and unforgiving, held its secrets close. The disappearance of Paul Fugate would come to haunt not just a small community around Chiricahua, but the entire National Park Service. It would become a cold case that confounded experts, baffled law enforcement, and left a family desperate for answers. A man who had devoted his life to protecting a wilderness had become part of it in the most terrifying and inexplicable way. And so, the first chapter of this mystery is not the story of who Paul was, but the story of how a man can vanish without a trace, leaving nothing behind but questions in a wilderness that seems almost alive with secrets. By the time night fell over Chiricahua National Monument, a creeping fear had taken root. Paul Fugate had vanished into the twisting labyrinth of volcanic rock and pine, leaving nothing behind. Rangers, local law enforcement, and volunteers began an immediate search. But the desert seemed to mock their efforts. Every ridge they climbed, every canyon they scanned, returned only silence. The wilderness was alive, but not with answers. Helicopters cut through the darkening sky, their beams slicing across the rugged terrain. The search dogs, finally trained, strained at their leashes, noses twitching at traces of scent that quickly vanished, as though Paul had never set foot on the trails. The first 24 hours, the golden window for rescues, slipped away with no leads, no footprints, no clues. The park staff worked in grim rotation, combing trails that Paul had walked daily for years. Some described the sensation as if the rocks themselves had swallowed him, as if the canyon walls had shifted overnight to erase his presence. Volunteers reported that the normally soothing wind felt oppressive, carrying whispers of movement where none existed. Every echo, every snap of a twig seemed pregnant with foreboding. Initial speculation was cautious. An accident? Possible encounter with wildlife? But the park was well known to Paul. He knew the jagged formations, the hidden ravines, and the safest routes better than anyone, and yet he had vanished. As hours turned to days, the grim realization settled in. Paul Fugate had disappeared from a place that was supposed to be his domain. The media caught wind of the story quickly. Newspapers called it the ranger who vanished and Arizona's chilling mystery. Interviews with colleagues revealed a man meticulous in his duties, unlikely to leave without word, unlikely to vanish by choice. The public was captivated, the mystery spreading like wildfire. But fascination carried with it fear. How could a man simply disappear from the heart of a well-patrolled national monument? Rangers scoured every inch of the faraway ranch area, using every resource available. Topographical maps, radio sweeps, helicopter patrols, and coordinated ground searches. They questioned local residents and transit workers, scouring trails near ranches and even abandoned mines. Nothing. The terrain, unforgiving and intricate, offered no explanation, only dead ends. As days stretched into weeks, volunteers reported strange occurrences. Some claimed to see a lone figure in the shadows, always just out of reach. Others felt sudden chills while searching in areas where Paul was most likely to have been. Nothing could be verified, yet the sensation of being watched was unanimous. The monument's beauty had always carried a quiet majesty, but now it harbored menace. Meanwhile, law enforcement pieced together witness statements. One report, coming from a man traveling near the park, suggested seeing Paul slump between two strangers in a pickup truck along a back road near the monument's edge. Though the claim was never confirmed, it ignited speculation of abduction, a theory so chilling it made the skin crawl of those who had known Paul as a calm, composed man devoted to the wilderness. Reward posters appeared in nearby towns. "Have you seen Ranger Paul Fugate?" they asked, the bold letters stark against images of his smiling face in uniform. $5,000, then $10,000. Money offered for information that might finally pierce the silence of the desert. Tips trickled in, almost all dead ends, some plainly fabricated, but every one of them fueled the tension. The sense that the wilderness was hiding something more sinister than anyone could imagine. By the end of the first month, frustration and fear mingled in equal measure. Search teams were exhausted, helicopters grounded for weather or mechanical issues, dogs weary from endless tracking, and yet the park remained silent. Every search that turned up nothing seemed to deepen the mystery, and the question that haunted all who knew him grew louder. How do you disappear from a place that you know better than anyone else? The disappearance of Paul Fugate had begun to transcend a simple missing person case. It became a puzzle that taunted everyone who sought an answer. The park was no longer merely a landscape of natural beauty. It had become a character in its own right. Unpredictable, impenetrable, and possibly complicit in hiding the truth. And as the first weeks faded into months, the chilling reality set in. Paul Fugate had vanished without a trace. The wilderness he had sworn to protect had claimed him, and somewhere in its vast, shadowed expanse, the truth lingered, just out of reach, waiting for someone bold or desperate enough to uncover it. If you've made it this far, you're the kind of person who needs answers as badly as we do. Make sure you're subscribed, because the deeper we go, the darker this story gets. As days became weeks, the empty trails of Chiricahua National Monument whispered only questions. How could Paul Fugate vanish without leaving so much as a single footprint, a stray item, or a radio call? Investigators and locals alike began to piece together fragments of possibility, each theory darker than the last. In the absence of answers, imagination flourished, and fear grew. The first whispers pointed to foul play. The region surrounding Chiricahua was not untouched by human vice. Isolated ranches dotted the borderlands, and over the years, law enforcement had noted the occasional smuggling of drugs and contraband through hidden desert routes. Some suggested Paul might have stumbled onto a clandestine operation, someone he had no business confronting on his routine patrol. The thought was chilling. A man devoted to the safety of the land, caught in the unseen currents of human greed and violence. Then there was the abduction theory, fueled by a single, unsettling witness report. A motorist traveling near a back road claimed to have seen Paul slump between two men in a pickup truck that moved slowly along the desert rim. Nothing to confirm the account. Law enforcement searched the area and interrogated nearby residents, but no physical evidence could validate the sighting. Yet the notion of sudden, violent removal of the ranger ignited a lingering fear, as if the desert itself had conspired with human hands to erase him. Some voices floated the idea of a voluntary disappearance, imagining that Paul, exhausted by duty or personal burdens, had chosen to vanish into the desert on his own terms. But such speculation was weak. He had left behind his wallet, his radio, personal effects, all the markers of a man tethered to his daily life. He had no known enemies, no debts, no history of escapism. Voluntary disappearance seemed unlikely, yet the human mind, desperate to find order in chaos, clung to even the faintest thread of possibility. Then came the environmental theory, the grim reminder of the park's treacherous beauty. Chiricahua's terrain is unforgiving. Lava rocks twist into spires and pinnacles. Hidden ravines and gullies can swallow the unwary in an instant. Paul was familiar with every trail, but familiarity does not grant immunity. Perhaps he had taken a misstep, fallen, or been trapped somewhere no search party could reach. But searchers reported every possible crevice, every deep canyon, every abandoned cave, and still nothing. The land, it seemed, had claimed him willingly, leaving no sign of struggle. Investigators also noted the psychological element of the wilderness itself. Rangers often speak of the park watching you, the sensation of being small in a landscape larger than imagination. Many searchers reported an eerie unease while combing the trails. Fleeting shapes in peripheral vision, whispered sounds that seemed almost like voices carried by the wind. Some dismissed it as fatigue, the mind tricking itself under stress. Others insisted it was more, a presence within the rock and forest, indifferent yet ever-present, absorbing the missing ranger into its silent embrace. And yet, despite the grim array of theories, one thing was clear. Each explanation raised more questions than answers. If foul play had occurred, why was there no physical trace? If he had disappeared voluntarily, why abandon all belongings and fail to notify anyone? If the wilderness had claimed him, why had searchers found no evidence of even an accidental fall? Each theory, plausible on its surface, faltered under scrutiny, leaving the truth concealed beneath layers of shadow, fear, and unanswered what-ifs. In small towns surrounding the monument, locals whispered about the ranger that the rocks took. Hunters, hikers, and transit workers shared tales of fleeting figures glimpsed from afar, a man in a uniform walking silently along a ridge, only to vanish when approached. Law enforcement dismissed most stories, but the accounts contributed to an eerie aura surrounding the case, a sensation that Paul's disappearance was not merely a mystery, but haunting, a riddle left by the desert itself. Psychologists consulted by the authorities suggested that the collective anxiety surrounding the disappearance created fertile ground for speculation. The unknown is terrifying. The mind invents shadows to fill the void. But for Paul's family, these theories were not comforting. They were torture. Every new suggestion of danger or deliberate removal conjured visions of Paul's suffering, struggling, or worse, while the wilderness remained indifferent, an unfeeling accomplice to the unknown. By the end of the first month, investigators were left with chilling realization. Paul Fugate had entered the park as a man, and the wilderness may have returned nothing but questions. His absence had transformed Chiricahua from a place of natural beauty into a theater of uncertainty. Every search, every tip, every theory fed into the haunting narrative that would grip the region and soon the nation for decades to come. And in that first month of speculation, one haunting truth became undeniable. The disappearance of man devoted to protecting the land had created a mystery that refused to yield to reason. In the silence of canyons and the shifting shadows of the volcanic spires, the world seemed to whisper a single, terrifying question to all who dared to search. What really happened to Paul Fugate? Weeks after Paul Fugate disappeared, the search had settled into a tense routine. Helicopters scanned ridges and sweeping arcs. Search parties combed the jagged trails, and volunteers patrolled the undergrowth, their flashlights piercing the dark corners of the monument. Yet, as the days bled into weeks, hope waned, and then came the first report that changed everything. A local rancher, driving along a remote back road near the eastern edge of the park, claimed he had seen something unusual in the late afternoon. His words would send chills through every investigator who heard them. He described a man slumped between two strangers in a pickup truck. The ranger's uniform was unmistakable. The gold-colored badge glinted faintly in the desert sun. It was Paul Fugate, and yet he was not moving. The rancher's account, initially dismissed by some as a trick of the light or desert mirage, was reported to authorities. Law enforcement took it seriously, immediately dispatching units to canvass the area. The pickup truck, however, had vanished, leaving only tire tracks that disappeared into the dust, then abruptly ended, as if the vehicle had evaporated into thin air. Investigators were faced with a terrifying possibility. Paul may have been abducted, but why? And by whom? The remote roads surrounding Chiricahua were lightly traveled, and the park's landscape offered few escape routes for vehicles large enough to carry a man forcibly. Whoever had taken him had done so with precision and preparation, slipping through the desert without leaving a trace. Yet, the witness was not entirely certain. His description was based on a fleeting glance. An instant before the pickup disappeared behind a hill. Some details were hazy. The color of the truck, the exact features of the men inside. But one element was undeniable. The ranger's limp posture. It was a silent scream frozen in time, a terrifying snapshot that hinted at human involvement rather than accident or voluntary disappearance. The report reignited the case. Law enforcement scoured the surrounding highways, interviewed travelers and local residents, and checked records for vehicles matching the description. Theories that had remained speculative suddenly seemed plausible. That Paul had stumbled into a dangerous situation he could not escape. But even as officers followed leads, the desert maintained its silence. The tire tracks vanished. There were no witnesses to corroborate the rancher's sighting, no physical evidence to indicate a struggle. It was as if the land had conspired to erase not only Paul Fugate, but the very trail that could have led to him. Locals, hearing the news, began to whisper the monument's secret shadows, hidden paths where humans rarely tread, and where even the vigilant could disappear. Stories surfaced of hikers who had once glimpsed figures standing in remote valleys, only for them to vanish when approached. These tales, anecdotal and unverified, fed the aura of unease, a place where the ordinary rules of life and even time seemed suspended. For Paul's family, the witness account was both terrifying and tantalizing. It offered the possibility that he was alive, that someone, somewhere, knew what had happened, but also introduced a new layer of horror. The idea that a man devoted to protecting the wilderness could be taken unseen by forces beyond comprehension. Investigators expanded their search radius, now focusing on hidden roads and seldom-used back trails. The National Park Service increased its outreach, appealing to the public for any information. The reward climbed higher, an incentive in hopes of breaking the suffocating silence. But the desert remained indifferent, and the singular glimpse reported by the rancher became a haunting fragment, a possible truth swallowed by the vast, unforgiving landscape. The witness account, though unconfirmed, shifted the narrative. No longer was Paul Fugate merely lost. He was potentially taken, a man whose fate lay in the hands of unknown forces. Every question deepened. How could two men move a seasoned ranger without a struggle? What had he seen that day, and did it cost him his freedom or his life? The monument, with its soaring rock pinnacles and hidden crevices, had become a stage for something sinister. And in the minds of those chasing answers, a fear took hold. The wilderness itself might be complicit, its vastness concealing more than just nature's secrets. Somewhere in its shadowed canyons, Paul Fugate's story was continuing, though unseen and unheard, a mystery that refused to bend to the light of reason or the persistence of searchers. In the cold, silent desert, one truth was clear. The witness had seen something real, and whatever it was enough to make investigators and the public look at the monument not just as a sanctuary of beauty, but as a place where the ordinary rules of life no longer applied, and where a single misstep could vanish a man forever. Nearly 4 decades had passed since that chilling January day in 1980 when Paul Fugate disappeared into the vast wilderness of Chiricahua National Monument. Years turned into decades, and still the monument held its silence. The landscape, jagged and timeless, had remained unyielding, keeping its secrets hidden from search parties, investigators, and Paul's grieving family. Yet, in 2018, a spark of renewed hope emerged, a sign that the story of the lost ranger was far from over. The National Park Service, frustrated by decades of dead ends and unsolved questions, announced a new effort to find answers. This time, the stakes were higher. The reward for information leading to Paul's whereabouts, or the apprehension of anyone responsible for his disappearance, was tripled to $60,000. It was more than a number. It was a symbol, an acknowledgement that time had not erased the need for justice, closure, or truth. Detectives and rangers reopened the case files, poring over decades-old documents, witness reports, and physical evidence that had long gathered dust. Each detail was scrutinized. The last confirmed sighting of Paul leaving the visitor center, the reported backroad abduction, the countless searches of rocky gullies and crevices. Patterns were re-examined, inconsistencies revisited. New technology allowed for fresh analysis of old photographs, aerial imagery, and terrain mapping, searching for clues that may have been overlooked in the analog era of the 1980s. For investigators, one question loomed over all else. Had Paul Fugate ever left the park alive? Or had the wilderness claimed him in some way that defied explanation? Some theorized that advanced forensic techniques might uncover the faintest trace of his presence, dried blood hidden beneath rocks, footprints preserved in seldom-traveled paths, or perhaps evidence long overlooked in the original searches. The renewed investigation also reached into the digital age. Local communities and social media networks became part of the search, with photographs of the park, drone surveys, and tip lines designed to collect even the most minor leads. Volunteers revisited remote trails, scouring abandoned cabins, caves, and hidden valleys for any sign of the ranger who had vanished nearly 40 years prior. Yet, even with the infusion of modern technology and human diligence, the silence remained profound. Nothing could be found. Each trail that yielded no sign of Paul deepened the monument's aura of menace. Helicopters swooped over the peaks, drones hovered over ravines, and thermal scans were conducted, but the vastness of the park made it nearly impossible to comb completely. It was as if the wilderness had absorbed him entirely, erasing his existence as though he had never walked among its rocks and spires. For Paul's family, the renewed investigation brought a complex blend of hope and torment. His wife, Dodie, expressed a mixture of cautious optimism and enduring grief. "We want answers," she said, voice steady but eyes hollowed by decades of waiting. "Everybody who's in this family is in pain, and will be until we find Paul." Their determination, unwavering even after 40 years, inspired law enforcement and volunteers alike, yet underscored the haunting reality. Time does not heal mysteries, and decades of silence can weigh heavier than the truth itself. Media outlets covering the renewed search amplified the tension. Headlines blared of the ranger who vanished and the Chiricahua mystery that endures. Public fascination reignited, with true crime enthusiasts, armchair detectives, and local historians poring over every scrap of information. Each new theory, each tantalizing lead, carried the same eerie undertone. The park itself seemed to hold its secrets close, revealing them only on terms it dictated. The renewed investigation also prompted law enforcement to revisit fringe leads, reports that had been previously dismissed or overlooked. Transient workers, hunters, and hikers who had been in the park during the early 1980s were re-interviewed, hoping for a memory, a detail, a fragment that could illuminate the truth. Every tip was cross-referenced, every report cataloged, yet the trail remained cold. And so, as 2018 progressed, a chilling paradox emerged. Despite the renewed effort, the mystery deepened. Technology, manpower, and decades of experience had yet to break the grip of the monument's silence. Chiricahua National Monument had become more than a place of natural beauty. It was a labyrinth of unanswered questions, a reminder that some truths, no matter how desperately sought, can remain hidden for generations. In revisiting the case, investigators confronted a sobering thought. The disappearance of Paul Fugate was not merely an event of the past. It was an active, living mystery. The land had endured. Time had passed, and yet the question remained, almost audibly echoing through the canyons. What truly happened to a ranger who walked into the park one afternoon and was never seen again? Even now, the hope that someone, somewhere, might uncover a clue keeps the search alive. But the wilderness watches patiently, indifferent, and the monument continues to hold its secrets close, waiting, as if it knows that some answers are meant to haunt rather than console. The forest surrounding the national park had always been a place of serenity, a sanctuary of rustling leaves and whispering pines. But for the family and colleagues of Paul Fugate, it had become a theater of unanswered questions, a reminder of a life interrupted and a mystery that refused to fade. More than a decade had passed since Fugate vanished during a routine patrol, yet the void left in his absence was as tangible as the dense fog that often blanketed the park at dawn. For his wife, Dodie, every sunrise was a bittersweet reminder of the man she loved and the life they had built together. "Everybody who's in this family is in pain, and will be until we find Paul," she had told reporters, her voice steady yet laced with exhaustion. Her words were not merely a reflection of her grief. They were a testament to the enduring emotional toll of his disappearance. Each day without answers compounded the strain, weaving an invisible net of anxiety, fear, and hope that stretched across the lives of everyone who knew him. Dodie's grief was not confined to her alone. Friends and colleagues spoke of Fugate with a reverence that bordered on awe, recalling his unwavering dedication to the National Park Service. He was more than a ranger. He was a guardian, someone who carried the weight of the wilderness on his shoulders with both pride and humility. Tributes poured in from across the country, memorials at trailheads, plaques near ranger stations, and moments of silence during park ceremonies. Each act of remembrance was a subtle acknowledgement that, while his physical presence was gone, his spirit continued to guide those who walked the same paths he once patrolled. Fugate's legacy, it seemed, had become entwined with the park itself, a silent, enduring witness to both the beauty and the danger of the natural world he loved. Yet for all the memorials and tributes, the stark reality remained. Paul Fugate's disappearance was unresolved. Official investigations had stretched over months and years, involving local law enforcement, the National Park Service, and even federal agencies. Theories were countless and contradictory, ranging from accidental injury in the rugged terrain to abduction by criminals operating within or near the park. There were whispers about drug traffickers using remote backroads to move contraband, and speculation about whether Fugate had stumbled upon something or someone he shouldn't have. But despite exhaustive searches, forensic analyses, and countless hours of questioning witnesses, the trail ran cold. No definitive answers emerged, no clear explanation was found, and the park that had been his second home offered nothing but silence. The lack of closure weighed heavily on all who had known him. Colleagues who had once joked with him over campfires now walked the trails with subdued reverence, their steps echoing the absence of a man who had been their anchor in the wilderness. Friends and family wrestled with conflicting emotions, hope, despair, guilt, and the nagging question of whether they had overlooked some small detail that could have changed everything. For Dodie, every birthday, anniversary, and holiday carried a shadow of loss, each moment punctuated by the same unanswered question: where is Paul? The emotional toll extended beyond the family, touching the community and the countless park visitors who had admired his dedication and bravery. In the midst of this uncertainty, Fugate's legacy had taken on a dual nature. On one hand, it was a celebration of a life devoted to service, a reminder of the dedication and courage required to protect public lands and the people who enjoy them. On the other hand, it was an enduring symbol of vulnerability, a stark illustration of the risks that even the most skilled and vigilant individuals face when navigating the untamed wilderness. The parks, with their beauty and isolation, were not merely backdrops for leisure. They were landscapes of danger, and Fugate's story served as a haunting reminder that tragedy could strike even those trained to anticipate it. The question surrounding his disappearance, however, refused to die quietly. Did he encounter criminals in the backcountry, operating far from the eyes of law enforcement? Was he the victim of foul play, or had he chosen to vanish for reasons no one could discern? Could a simple accident, slipping on a remote trail, becoming trapped or lost, explain his absence, or was something far more sinister at play? Every theory had its advocates and detractors, each supported by fragments of evidence, witness accounts, or circumstantial details, but none provided a conclusive answer. In forums, documentaries, and true crime blogs, the debate continued, fueled by both fascination and frustration. The park, once a symbol of refuge, had become a stage for speculation, a labyrinth of what-ifs and maybes that mirrored the emotional uncertainty of those left behind. Despite the unresolved nature of the case, hope remained a quiet, persistent force. The National Park Service continued to seek information, maintaining an open line for tips and promising rewards for any lead that might bring closure. For Dodie, this was not merely a procedural formality. It was a lifeline. Every new report, every fragment of potential evidence, rekindled a fragile flame of possibility. She held on to it with unwavering determination, believing that someday the truth would emerge from shadows. Until that day came, the story of Paul Fugate would linger, a complex blend of courage, mystery, and grief. As years slipped by, the case evolved into something more than a missing person investigation. It became part of the collective memory of the park and the wider community. Rangers in training were told of Fugate not only as a figure of admiration, but also as a cautionary tale, illustrating the unpredictable and sometimes perilous nature of the job they had chosen. His name appeared in lectures, articles, and memorial events, ensuring that the lessons drawn from his disappearance would endure long after those who remembered him personally had passed on. In this sense, Fugate's legacy was immortal. A life remembered not just for the service rendered, but for the questions left unanswered, the courage displayed in the face of unknown dangers, and the emotional imprint left on all who loved him. The final truth of what happened to Paul Fugate may never be known. The forest that swallowed him continues to stand, silent and indifferent, its trails and ravines unchanged by the human drama that unfolded within them. But in the hearts of those who loved him, in the dedication of the National Park Service, and in the ongoing search for answers, Fugate's presence is undeniable. His story is a haunting testament to the fragility of life, the resilience of those left behind, and the enduring human desire to confront the unknown, no matter how elusive the answers may be. The case remains open, the questions unanswered, and the hope for closure persists, a silent promise that someday, perhaps, the truth will finally emerge from the wilderness. Even as the sun sets over the park, casting long shadows across the trails he once walked, Paul Fugate's legacy continues to resonate, a reminder of service, of sacrifice, and of the mysteries that lie hidden in the world's most beautiful places. The forest remembers him, and so do we. Somewhere out there, beneath the endless canopy of the park, the truth about Paul Fugate still waits. It could be buried in the soil, etched into a forgotten trail, or sealed behind the lips of someone who knows more than they've ever said. 40 years of silence have only deepened the mystery, and until that silence breaks, Paul Fugate will keep walking these woods, not in body, but in the questions that will never stop chasing him. If stories like this keep you up at night, you're in the right place. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next mystery.